Hi, my name is Robyn Dupuis, and today I'll be talking to you about the political and economic history of Canada. I decided to do Canada because I am Canadian, and I enjoy having robust political and economic discussions with my dad, and I thought knowing the history of it a little bit would just pack a little more punch in our next discussion. So I'll start with telling you just a little bit about the history of Canada. Obviously, it's quite a short history. We haven't been around for all that long, but it actually started back in the late 15th century when French and British started to explore Canada. The French tended to go more into the interior of Canada, and fur was a main industry, whereas the British stayed along the Atlantic coast to start off with and develop more of an agricultural society. Now, obviously, Hudson Bay Company and that, you had the British and the French working together, of course, with the First Nations as well. By 1750, British far outweighed the French population, and as it inevitably does, it led to a war. In 1763, the end of the 7-Year War came about, with the French ceding their colonies to the British, with the exception of a couple small islands off the east coast that they used for fishing and drying their fish and so on and so forth. Now, this was a really, really interesting and important time in Canada's history because it really set the path for being a country with two distinct and separate societies in it, which it's a source of pride, certainly for myself and I think for a lot of Canadians. The British did this by protecting French property, religious, and social cultural customs. Obviously, the French were more Catholic. Property laws were very different, and just the laws were based on a different rule of law. So it was very interesting that that happened. 1763, the British also signed the Royal Proclamation, which regulated trade, settlement, and land purchases with the First Nations. So 1763, things started to really come together for Canada, and it became a country that tried to work with all the different peoples within the land. Now, over the next 80 years, there was quite a lot of turmoil in the country, obviously with the U.S., loyalists, separatists, all that good stuff going on, and eventually a Canadian and U.S. border was defined. Now, this brings us up to July 1st, 1867, the day on which the Dominion of Canada was formed. Now, from this, Canada became a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarchy. Now, there are three sort of main reasons why Canada was formed. One of the reasons that the British really pushed for that, and Canadians as well, was that Canada as a united country was thought to be more likely and more able to protect itself from a potential U.S. invasion. Infrastructure was another reason. Maritimes needed a railroad built so that they could connect more with the rest of the country, and the rest of the country needed the railroad so that it didn't have to go through the States, and it could get their export goods out to the Maritimes to get out to Europe and Britain. Now, the third reason, and perhaps the most interesting reason, was that they really wanted a responsible government to be formed. So by forming provincial government, they were able to have that responsible government and better work on legislation and governing the people. Now, jumping back just a few years, by 1850, 800,000 immigrants were living in Canada. And this was a rapid increase in the population, and it led post-Confederation to a rapid industrialization and urbanization. Factories began to be built, and it brought in people from mostly agricultural society, brought them into the towns which were now being formed. Investment and export boomed during that period as well. Now, Canada still to this day retains that reliance on exports. It's the 12th largest export economy in the world. At that time, back in the late 1800s, Timber remained a massive export, but dairying and livestock also grew. It expanded significantly, with exports going out to Europe as well as the United States. The export industry continued to grow and expand. So in the 1890s, wheat became a major crop. Electrical equipment and chemicals was a new industry that was introduced to Canada, and it also, created more factories, brought more people into Canada and more people in from agricultural areas. 1900s, you're looking at production of cars, aluminum. The 20s, you're looking at radio and home appliances. In the 1940s, aircraft was a major industry with Bombardier. So Canada is a liberal market economy, continued to grow basically from Confederation. But both federal and provincial governments play a larger part than most LMEs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So an example, though, now of how Canada's governments play more of a role is interregional subsidies. These were introduced in the 1950s, and they're a deeply ingrained part of the Canadian way of life. What this means is that the have provinces, for example, Alberta for many years was a have province with its oil industry, contribute equalization payments to the have-not provinces. Typically, the Maritimes has been a good example of this. They've suffered massively by overfishing, and their economies just basically shut down. Starting to recover a bit now, and Alberta's starting to shut down, but that's the idea behind equalization payments. Now, jumping back again just a little bit to World War I. World War I really fragmented the country, and it hit the economy hard. Fragmented the country in that the French did not want to join the war at all, and Britain obviously had joined the war. So it fragmented the country in that way. Economic unrest was obviously compounded the issue. However, post-World War I, things started to get a little bit better. The Liberal government issued a conservative domestic policy. Things included in that policy were the lowering of significantly increased wartime taxes, the diffusion of post-war labor conflicts. So there were quite a few labor conflicts that popped up post-World War I. And they also lowered tariffs. Now this was tricky because they had to lower the tariffs enough to keep the agricultural prairie economies happy, while still keeping the tariffs high enough, not making them too low for the industrial Ontario economy. So it was an interesting balancing act that the government had to undertake. And this is another example of how the Canadian economy is very fragmented. Now, the Wall Street crash hit Canada pretty hard. Between 1929 and 1933, GDP went down by 33%. Exports sank by 50%. So we're talking about an economy that heavily relies on exports to keep it going, and those exports sank by 50%. Additionally, which resulted in 20%, 1/5 of the population being on government assistance during this period. In 1930, there were elections and a new government was brought in. They tried to introduce a sort of U.S. New Deal type policies. This did not sit well with the Canadian population at all, and most of their policies were never passed, resulting in a one-term government. So in 1935, after the elections, the former government was brought back in with Lyon Mackenzie King at the head. So King set to work right away from 1935, lowering tariffs. He signed a trade treaty with the U.S., which increased in a huge increase in trade, and it really helped to bring the economy out of trouble. It was at that period of time that the government also started to acquire national companies, companies such as Canadian Broadcast Corporation, Trans-Canada Air, the National Film Board of Canada, and in 1938 they acquired the Bank of Canada, reacquired the Bank of Canada. It's very interesting that Canada actually didn't adopt EI, or unemployment insurance, as it's called elsewhere, until 1940. It was one of the last economies, Western economies, to do so. They implemented sort of other policies throughout, but it's such an ingrained part of Canadian society. EI, healthcare, parental leave, that it's interesting to know that they didn't adopt it until, you know, they're a late adopter. So the economy continued to thrive through to the 70s when the oil crisis hit, and like many economies throughout the world, Canada suffered during this period of time. Unemployment in the late 60s was about 3%. After 1973, unemployment rose to 8.5%, and inflation rose as well. It peaked at 12% in 1974. So while not as bad as some economies, it still wasn't fantastic. So to combat this crisis, the government implemented tighter monetary policy and with high real interest rates. Now we're going to see how high these interest rates got in just a moment. Canada continued to experience trouble through to the recession of the early 80s. Inflation continued to be high. Interest rates peaked 21% in the early 80s, sort of the 81 to 83 period. In there, it peaked at 21%. There was significant underemployment, and on top of that, the states floated their dollar instead of tying it to the gold standard, which contributed to the significant devaluation of the Canadian dollar. So all of these issues made for a very, very difficult early 1980s for Canada. Now, from about the mid-80s through to the mid-90s, the government had several policy changes. One of these was to include selling off several crown corporations. They did retain many of the iconic institutions, though, and there's still many, many crown corporations. The National Film Board of Canada is an example of one they've retained, and it's iconic in Canada. Every single Canadian has memories of the 80s watching these cartoon commercials with, you know, short historical vignettes. And if you haven't seen the Loggerman's dance, it's well worth looking up on YouTube. It's an iconic part of Canadian history. Now, the uncertainty in the economy in the early 80s led to slowdown of investment in new technology and equipment and overall productivity. By 1985, though, the economy had begun to recover and it began to expand again. However, this uncertainty in the economy and lack of investment continued through to the 90s. In about 1987, Canada transitioned from being a more manufacturing-based society to having more focus on a service-based industry. This went through into the 90s when businesses started to realize that technology and moving forward had really changed, been neglected in the 80s, so they began focusing on technology and business restructures to be more competitive on the global market. The government changed, they cut fiscal deficits, and they achieved a balanced budget by 97 and surpluses for the next few years thereafter. Inflation decreased, unemployment dropped to 25-year low. The Canadian economy continues to be strong. It was very strong through the GFC, and the mix of an LME with a social conscience is one that works well for the Canadian people and the Canadian economy. So that's a quick history of Canada. Thanks for watching.